All right, so today we are going over the last installment of our apologetics series, and we're going to review what we've done over the past several weeks, and then also kind of some more personal notes on how to apply this in everyday life. So, we started out talking about why Christianity made sense, why it was rational to believe in the truths of Christianity. And so we talked about the rationality of the belief in God. And this included all sorts of things. First of all, we talked about how that some idea of God is actually required in every philosophy for it to make sense. And that, so, if we define God as that which is self-existent, we actually find out that we all believe in God of some sort. What we differ on is the nature of God. But we can see that God, as described in the Bible, is consistent with what we see in reality. We see this through a variety of things, including the rationality of the universe, that animals have an internal organization to them, and that there's a moral law that pervades what we do. There's just several things in nature that reflect the way that we were created and the Creator Himself. And then we also found that common objections to the biblical God, like the problem of evil and that sort of thing, don't stand up to scrutiny. But just knowing God exists is not sufficient. Christianity is based on the truth of what Christ did for us, the death and resurrection of Christ. And for that, we show that we actually have a documented chain of evidence about the resurrection, which comes within 5 years of the event and includes lists of witnesses to the resurrection. So the early church was concerned about evidence, told where they got their evidence, and listed out names of people that people at the time could go and check for verification of the evidence. The Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or close associates, and we talked about the evidence for that in history. There's also a category of evidence called undesigned coincidences that we talked about. And basically, that is where there are interesting things that line up in the different Gospels that only make sense if you think of them as being the same event told by different people. And they line up in really interesting ways that if they were copying from one another, they wouldn't make sense. And if they were merely trying to answer questions that arose from one another, they wouldn't make sense. They only really make sense if when viewed as three different, multiple different instances of different people telling the same story. So then you have the early church itself. It was very concerned with evidence, and they actively sought to only include truthful accounts. So they tried to figure out there were false gospels that were being spread in the early days of Christianity, and the early church wanted to figure out which ones are true and which ones are false. And interestingly, those false gospels actually give really good evidence of the true gospels, because there's a very marked difference between the nature of a true gospel and nature of a false gospel. And we went over those different characteristics, what they look like, and how you can tell the true from the false. And then through the generations, it's not enough for it to be written down. It also has to be transmitted through the generations. And we have evidence that the documents themselves were reliably handed down through the generations. And if you just take the generally agreed upon facts by most historians about what happened concerning the life and death of Jesus, what happened to the apostles, the thing that makes most sense from all of that is that the resurrection really did occur. Then we talked about the nature of reality itself. As Christians, we have a worldview that is not just about the bare facts of existence of God and Jesus, but this all implicates a wider worldview, a wider picture of reality. Christianity holds that the moral and spiritual aspects of life are just as real as the physical aspects of life, and they're actually probably more important. So this is the nature of reality that we carry with us as Christians. And you find that everybody experiences the world in this way. We experience the world in terms of beauty, spirituality, and that we experience that there's more to our lives than merely our physical selves. What Christianity does is it makes this understanding consistent, gives us a consistent viewpoint for our internal and our external experiences, for the history of the world, for the way that the world works, and it makes a coherent, cohesive whole. The more kind of the atheistic view, the naturalistic, the physicalistic, the ones that view life as only being matter and motion, they always wind up presenting a distorted picture of the world that we live in. But as I said, through Christianity, we can get a more full, more broad, and more complete picture of what reality looks like that is consistent with our experience. So then we talked about how we can take this knowledge of God and put it to work. Because this is called more than a defense. We're not just talking about defending the truths of Scripture. We're talking about how we take that understanding of the veracity of Scripture and pushing that forward in practical aspects of our daily lives. So a couple of places that we talked about. So inside the church, apologetics, it's helpful for getting Christians to understand the truthfulness of their faith, that it's not just a personal preference, it's not just a something that I'm holding on to, it's the truth. The other thing is that it helps you maintain your faith in times of struggle and pain. So, we all go through difficult times, and during the difficult times is usually not the time for apologetics. But if you had apologetics training ahead of time, then when you hit the times of struggle and pain, it helps you to maintain your hold on Christian truth. And finally, it provides encouragement for engaging with your faith in public. Because if you're assured of the things that you believe, then you're going to be less timid about sharing them in the wider world and using them in the wider world. So apologetics is not helpful. I always like looking at the limits to what any topic. I'm a computer programmer. In addition to knowing how computer programming helps people, I also like to know when computer programming is not the right answer. And likewise for apologetics, there's times when it's the answer, there's times when it's not the answer. So apologetics is not helpful for helping people out in times of pain. They don't need to know intellectual answers for why they're in pain. That's not a helpful process. And then apologetics is not a replacement for a relationship with God. We're not called to think about God. We're called to love God. And so apologetics helps us in many things, but it's not a replacement for our faith. So then outside the church, apologetics is helpful for demonstrating that Christianity is a rational point of view. Okay, so this is helpful for a lot of things. For example, if you're trying to introduce Christian principles into whatever you're doing, if you're trying to introduce Christian principles into your job, into your company, into your society, being able to show that it's a rational point of view will help give you confidence for that and help you to justify its inclusion to other people. It can also be used to remove obstacles for people coming to faith. So some people want to be Christians, but they have some intellectual hangups. They're like, I have these questions that were not answered. And so an understanding of apologetics can help you lead people through that. It shows that Christianity has a place in the public square, that this is, again, this is not just preference. This is not Star Wars versus Star Trek. We're talking about reality, and we have a connection between what Christianity says and reality. It's helpful for helping people examine the consistency of their own worldview, because the consistency of worldviews is one of the things that shows Christianity to be true. And so it then helps people ask the questions of themselves, do I have an internally consistent worldview? Apologetics helps you know what questions to ask other people. and it helps you have the confidence that you need to reach out. Apologetics is not helpful in the area of salvation. Salvation is not a mental assent. It's not just saying, yes, I agree. A saving trust in Jesus means that you are relying on Jesus for your salvation, not just that it says in the Bible, even the demons believe and they're afraid. So it's not just a mental assent that this is correct, it's trusting in Jesus. And then we can go even further beyond apologetics and put these principles to work. And so this is about having the confidence to take theological principles and apply them in more practical areas. And so we looked at a couple of areas. We looked at science, and we showed that theology itself laid the groundwork for science by proposing an orderly universe from an orderly lawgiver, and it also gave a theological benefit for searching for the truth. So if you were, our search for the truth is understanding God himself, because God, as the creator, the more we understand about the things that he made, the more that we can understand him. And so theology provided both a justification for doing it and a benefit from doing it. And then specifically, theology has provided the theoretical basis for many of the biggest advances in science. We looked in many of the foundations of physics, in genetics, and computing are all based directly or indirectly on theological principles. And we also talked about where theology and science tend to work best together. So not always for every individual scientific finding, but theology and science work best together when theology provides a framework for thinking about problems, and then science fills in the details. And this tends to be the place where the interaction between theology and science wind up being most fruitful. They're both aimed at truth, and so we should expect them to always eventually meet up, even if they don't meet up at every point right now. Both disciplines are incomplete, and therefore the fact that there might be some issues on the edges is not so problematic. Even within science, there are contradictions between individual sciences, and these are not problems. They're just it just means that we have more work to do. And then even more so we've shown that science is compatible and was even brought forth from theology, but additionally, science is actually incompatible with the idea that everything is just physics and matter, because it undermines the rationality of science. And we looked at how that was the case. We also looked at how theology applies to policy making, and not just public policy, but any sort of policy, family policy, company policy. Humans generally, whenever we are trying to make the world a better place, we make some rules that help us to do that. And so those are policies. And understanding Christianity deeply provides a good basis for thinking about policy decisions. It helps us think about the issues that are at play, because most policies deal with people, and people are spiritual creatures. And so understanding spirituality deeply will help you to develop policies that interact with people's spiritual nature. Also, the Ten Commandments provides a great template for policy making. It's got a limited number of rules. It's got the policies themselves apply to everyone. They discourage destructive behavior. They're useful for teaching, and they're foundational to the other rules. And we talked about each of those in detail and why those are important to policy making, and how the Ten Commandments provides a template for that. And we showed that in the New Testament, you can actually further simplify things if you have a group of people who are committed to the same ideals. You can simply have policies that express the attitudes by which you're trying to govern yourselves, and those can substitute for many rules. And so, Jesus summarized the Ten Commandments into two. So So then the point of these application areas was not to say, well, these are the main ways we should apply theology, but rather just, policy making and science are things that pretty much everyone interacts with all the time. And so they seem to provide a pretty good cross-section of things that might pertain to you. But theology actually applies everywhere. And so my challenge to you is that knowing the truth of the gospel, you should figure out how to apply it to whatever job you have or whatever field you're in. And the way that you do this, you kind of think about the main Christian doctrines. There's theology of creation, theology of humanity, the theology of sin, the theology of redemption and salvation. Think about those things and think about how they apply to whatever your occupation is. And taking the time to reflect on these things will give you a deeper understanding of whatever you do. And apologetics gives you the confidence that the world of theology and the world of everyday life intersect in a deep and powerful way. Now, I can't emphasize enough the term deep thinking. This is not about jumping headfirst with the first thing that springs to mind, because your theological ideas, just because you have ideas that stem from theology doesn't make them automatically right. It just gives you a good source of material for thinking about. So in order to really come up with good ideas and good ways for this to work, it requires continual sustained thinking about both the theological side and the practical side of various issues. So this is a lot of time and effort over a long period. You can, start out with the first thing that springs to mind, but you shouldn't just assume that because you have an idea that was inspired by theological thinking that is necessarily 100% accurate. It's all a process. It's just that theology can provide you a deeper context from which to draw ideas. You have a deeper well to draw from. All right, so you can think about it in terms of digging a well. Without theology, you only have a shallow well to draw from. But with theology, you can lower your bucket much deeper and find different sources of water deeper down. So how do we do deep thinking? Okay. So the things that you need to ask yourself are, what principles are in play in whatever I'm doing? What are the things that are going on? What are the deeper things? Why are we doing things the way that we're doing? Why is this business, this job set up the way it is? What's going on? What are, but not even necessarily principles anyone said out loud, but what are the underlying principles of whatever it is we're doing? Then you say, do any of these principles overlap with what Scripture teaches? You dig down, you find principles, you say, is there anything in Scripture that matches this principle? And then you say, am I missing any important principles that the Scriptures teach? Is there some principle I wasn't aware of, both in what I'm doing or what Scripture's teaching? And so think about, how can I dig deeper, both in Scripture and in thinking about my daily life, to find principles? And then you say, how is being informed by Scripture affecting how I look at the topic at hand? Okay. And then you dig down even further and say, what assumptions behind the current state of affairs are unstated? So a lot of times people operate using a variety of assumptions that everybody agrees with, but no one's bothered to say out loud. So they might be right or wrong, but no one's bothered to say them out loud. And until you think about them, you say, really, why are we doing this? What are the necessary assumptions for this logic to work? And then, are those things even true? And then you say, do those underlying assumptions align with Christian principles? And if they don't, you say, well, what are the assumptions we should bring into this which do align with Christian principles? And if you say, well, we shouldn't have assumptions, well, good luck doing anything without assumptions. The point is, you need to have assumptions that are grounded that are intellectually grounded, that you can't that each of your assumptions, you know what they are and why you're making them. Not that you could go without making any assumptions, because just to make sense of life, we wind up having to make simplifying assumptions all the time. What we want is those simplifying assumptions to be consistent with the deeper reality that's expressed by Scripture. So then we've got reaching out. So what we were talking about before is how to apply apologetics to what we do, but how do we reach out to other people with apologetics? One of the things that apologetics does, because we've talked a lot about worldviews and how things are consistent with Christianity and they're inconsistent with a material view of the world. One of the things that we should think about is helping people see themselves and see their own worldviews and how they line up with reality. Most people don't have the tools to examine their own preconceptions and worldviews. G.K. Chesterton said, "But what is actually the matter with the modern man is that he does not even know even his own philosophy, but only his own phraseology." That is, that people haven't really thought about the deep questions. They might have, simple answers, but they've actually learned those as little bits and pieces of phrases. They haven't really interacted with their philosophy deeply. And so our goal is to help them dig deeper and to really see what the consequences are of the way that they are thinking and how they can change that thinking to be more consistent with reality. And apologetics helps us to do that. Sometimes this is best accomplished by posing questions, but then letting the other person have the last word. Okay? And because what happens is that if you pose a question and they answer, and then you answer back, they kind of get into a defensive mode, and that's not helpful for helping them to reflect. If you just ask them a question that helps them to dig deeper, if they respond, even if they respond in a way that, kind of blowing you off, if you just kind of accept that, oftentimes that will help people to continue thinking on that question, and helps them just continue to introspect. There was an atheist biology professor named Richard Lumsden, and he had there was something in the news about creationists doing something, and he was very mad and gave a whole lecture on how terrible creationism was and whatnot. And then later, one of his students came by and said, "Hey, I just want you to, I was curious about what you said today in class, and can you explain further what you meant and why you think that is?" And so he did, and told her his viewpoint, and afterwards she said, "Thank you, professor," and went on her way. But he continued, since she didn't do anything that made him build up his defenses. He continued to think further, and eventually realized that the things that he had told her were actually wrong, and so he eventually figured out that the world was indeed created, and it all started because someone asked him a question, but didn't poke too hard. Let the person kind of let that sort of thought pattern and process flow through in a much more natural fashion. Apologetics will help us formulate the questions so that when someone's left alone with their own thoughts, they'll find that their own answers are self-defeating. And so this is one of the things that apologetics can help us do. Apologetics help people see the bigger picture more clearly, because God's really put in the world a lot of things that point back to him. And what happens is that, people living in the world have just learned to take the world for granted. They haven't learned to step back and ask themselves basic questions about what they see around them. And so a big part of apologetics is just helping people just see what's there. And there's, if you look at the universe, there is intricacy in every level of the universe, at every level of scale, from the smallest microbe to galaxies. There's intricacy at every level of scale. And it's actually hard to miss. People just get used to it because they just grew up people telling them that's the way it is, but they never think about why it is the way that it is. And so when you start asking those questions, it helps people to dig down deeper. Another thing is to help people see deeper significances in their own lives, and the significance of their own life. What is it in your worldview that gives your life significance? Is it anything? And so apologetics helps us to dig at those issues that they might not have thought about. And in fact, if you think about the way most people live and most people think, most people actually live in many cases as if Christianity is true. They live in ways that point to God, that point to bigger things bigger than themselves, as if the world isn't just matter and motion. They live in a way that points to bigger things, and just helping them to see that the way that many of the things that they already think and that already believe are consistent with Christianity and inconsistent with materialism and atheism. And then there's the things that most people, not everybody, but most people experience, and that they also point to things beyond themselves. Nature points beyond yourself. Children point beyond yourself. Society points beyond yourself. The fact that there are things that you value points beyond yourself. The mere existence of good and evil point beyond yourself. All these things are pointing up and beyond and outward, and showing that if you really think about these things, you need a point of view that takes all of these things seriously and takes them into account. Otherwise, your worldview is inconsistent with your experience of the world. So our job is to help them think more deeply about what these things really signify and what made them possible in the first place. Now, when we talk to the current generation, there's a lot of things that we have to keep in mind. First of all, we have to recognize that not everybody uses the same words the same way. So you might know exactly what you mean by your words, and they may mean something different to other people. We don't just have a special vocabulary. Sometimes we have a different dictionary altogether. So it's not just that we have different words, it's that sometimes the same words have completely different meanings. So for example, if you're talking about the subject of homosexuality, well, most Christians, when they use the term homosexual, what we mean is people who are actually engaging in that practice. And so if a Christian says something like homosexuality is a sin, well, what we mean is engaging in the practice of homosexuality is a sin. In the wider culture, homosexuality has been used to mean anyone who feels an attraction towards the same sex. Well, that's not the same thing. And so if somebody says, homosexuality is a sin, then somebody might hear something completely different. They might hear you say that even having a feeling of attraction towards someone of the same sex is a sin. And those aren't equivalent. Likewise, I found that a lot of people in the modern world view genetics and evolution as being the same thing. So if you tell someone, I don't believe in evolution, what they hear you say is, I don't believe in genetics. And so recognizing the fact that we're not always operating with the same dictionaries is really important to try to get ourselves to be heard so that our message gets through reliably and that people can even understand what it is that we're trying to say. The other thing to keep in mind is to be sure, if you're going to use apologetics, make sure that the issue is an intellectual one. And there's a good question that you can use to kind of help move that process along. And you can say, if you were to be convinced that Christianity is true, would you become a Christian? Right? And you might think the answer to that is obvious, but for a lot of people, the answer is no. That even if they were convinced that Christianity was true, they wouldn't become a Christian. And so there you have a heart issue, not an intellectual issue. And so apologetics would actually be the wrong tool for that. The other thing to keep in mind is that morality actually affects your intellect. Some people put up intellectual fronts when the actual issue is a moral one. I've seen this happen several times where somebody, because they've engaged in a sin of some sort, they the very next day, all of a sudden, they are doubting the existence of God because, hey, that's an easy way to justify my sin. Another thing to keep in mind is that having compassion on hurting people is more important than winning an argument. So apologetics is not about winning at all costs. It's a tool that's used in the right place and the right time. And the other thing to remember is that people come from real lives that have real hurts and real pains. And sometimes, even if someone approaches you with an intellectual question, oftentimes there's a deeper, more painful issue that's behind the intellectual question. So, if someone asks you, what about evil and suffering in the world? There might be some actual suffering that person has gone through that is really at the heart of what they're asking. And so just a straight intellectual answer might not be what they're needing, because there might actually be something deeper that needs healing. Another thing that's important is honesty. It's not the most important thing that you have answers to all the questions. The most important thing is that your credibility lends credibility to the gospel. And so when you don't know, if you say you don't know, that actually lends credibility to the gospel, to recognize that the people who are promoting the gospel are honest about where they are, what they're saying, and that we don't have that. If we were to wind up with a credibility problem where people didn't believe what we were saying, when people didn't think that they were getting honest answers from us, that's the bigger problem. So you should always be most cognizant about your own intellectual honesty. So you should never overplay an argument. I mean, not every argument is equally weighty, so you should never act like a weak argument is actually a strong one. If someone makes a good point that says, "Oh, here's an issue with the argument," you can concede a good point. There's nothing wrong with that. If you don't know the answer, you can say, "I don't know." If you don't know a lot of answers, saying "I don't know a lot" is perfectly acceptable. It's important to be honest. This is actually the biggest step towards intellectual maturity, is intellectual honesty, being able to really say, yes, I do know, or no, I don't know. People will respect you and your arguments if you're honest about them and about yourself. And if you're not, you're going to lose credibility both for yourself and for the gospel. In fact, I found that humility actually wins more than brazen confidence. The more that you can say, hey, well, this is the way I was thinking. And, don't say, this is how it is. This is, X plus Y equals Z. You just say, well, the way that I think about this is, and then, you just present what you present kind of your argument, and just say, this is the way that I'm thinking. And you're inviting a discussion rather than laying down a law. And this helps in a number of ways. First of all, it increases your credibility personally, but it also, we can all be wrong. And so if you say this argument is definitely true, well, if you wind up being wrong, well, then that hurts your credibility a little bit. But if you just said this is the way I think about it, well, everyone thinks about things wrong on occasion. And so if it wound up that your argument wasn't bulletproof, that's fine. It gave everybody something new and deeper to think about. Apologetics isn't salesmanship. It's a deep discussion about the deepest issues of reality and how to think about them. So then also, another important thing is knowing when to stop. As I said, I always like to know the limitations of whatever tool I'm using. Sometimes when someone asks a question, they're actually distracting from the real issue. So if let's say that you're getting to the heart of something, and then all of a sudden you get a bunch of little questions that may even be easy to answer, but you just start getting a lot of little simple questions. Maybe what you need to do is you need to stop answering questions and leave them with the deeper question. This is one thing that I do in online discussions, is that if there was an important point, and someone tries to derail the conversation to smaller points, I just won't even respond. I'll just leave it because I want the most important thing to be left as the last thing that we discuss. So sometimes just stepping out of an argument, knowing when the argument is finished, knowing when someone's being defensive instead of actually engaging, that's important to know. Actually being Jesus to someone is often a more powerful argument than the actual intellectual argument. And finally, remember that Christianity is not about having the correct worldview. Having a correct worldview is a nice outcome of Christianity, but that's not the point. It's about having an active relationship with our Creator. Intellectual issues might be a stepping stone, but that's not the destination. We're not trying to get them to an intellectual place. We're trying to get their heart to the right place. And so if we reach out to people with apologetics, just recognize that it's a stepping stone, but it's not the destination.